Marcus Hale was 37 years old when he made the most calculated decision of his marriage, and he made it standing in the parking lot of a tire shop in Memphis, Tennessee, with a gut feeling he could not argue away, and a phone already warm in his hand. To anyone who knew them from the outside, Marcus was the steady one, a logistics coordinator for a regional freight company driving the same four-door sedan for 6 years, wearing the same style of work boots his mother had bought him at a sale rack the winter before she passed. His wife, Elena, was the one people noticed first. She had built a modest event planning business over the prior 4 years, and she wore that success in the way she carried herself into rooms, and Marcus had been proud of her for it. The way a man is proud of something he helped lay a foundation under. What he had not told Elena, what he had not told most people, was that the logistics job was not the whole picture. He called his supervisor that Tuesday afternoon, arranged a personal day, and drove home early. He had prepared one sentence. He practiced it twice in the car. What happened in the next 6 hours told him everything the prior 9 years had not. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The neighborhood they lived in sat at the edge of a Memphis suburb, the kind of street where people kept their yards clean and waved from driveways and asked about each other's children by name. Their house was a 4-bedroom colonial that Marcus had bought 3 years into their marriage, putting 30% down in cash and negotiating the seller's agent himself, because he had always had a particular patience for numbers and for waiting out the moment when the other side got uncomfortable first. He had refinished the hardwood floors in the front room himself the summer after they moved in. A project that took 11 days and produced exactly one argument between them over whether to use a satin or semi-gloss finish, and which Elena had later admitted she barely noticed once it was done. The floors were beautiful. He had never mentioned the argument again. His grandmother, a woman who had raised 3 children in a 2-bedroom house in North Memphis and kept her finances in a shoebox until she was 62, had told him once when he was 13, "Baby, the way someone acts when the money stops is the only true thing you will ever learn about them." She had said it after his uncle's second wife departed the week his uncle lost his union position, taking the car and leaving the debt. Marcus had written nothing down. He had not needed to. He was a logistics man by title and by nature. He thought in routes, the most efficient path between 2 points, the contingencies when the primary route was compromised, the choke points where delay became failure. He applied this thinking to freight contracts and quarterly audits and quietly to the other half of his professional life. A small logistics consulting practice he had incorporated 5 years prior, which held contracts with 3 mid-sized distribution companies in Tennessee and Mississippi. That practice ran lean and visible only to his accountant and his attorney, a man named Victor Klein, who had handled Marcus's business affairs since the day Marcus walked into his office at 31 with a folder of handwritten projections and a clarity of intention that Victor would later describe as rare. Elena knew he did some consulting on the side. She had never asked what it was worth. The thing that started the unease was not one event. It was a sequence, the way these things always were for men who understood that a route doesn't fail at a single point. It fails at an accumulation of them. A dinner with Elena's business partner Brandon in February. The way Brandon had refilled Elena's glass without being asked and then looked at his own hand afterward like he'd surprised himself. A Friday evening in March when Elena was 2 hours later than she said she'd be and came home with a story about a venue walkthrough that had run long. And a faint trace of a cologne Marcus did not own that he noticed when he kissed her cheek and said he'd kept a plate warm for her. A phone left in a jacket pocket, not hidden, just forgotten, with a thread of messages Marcus had not sought and did not read past the first 2 lines before he put the jacket back where he found it, and sat down on the edge of the bed and breathed through his nose until his heart rate returned to something he recognized. He did not react. He was a logistics man. You did not reroute cargo on a feeling. You gathered data, you confirmed the pattern. Then you moved. He had thought about what to do for 3 weeks before he did it. He had considered and discarded several approaches. What he arrived at was the simplest and the cleanest. The one that required the least theater and would produce the clearest result. He called his supervisor from the parking lot and arranged to work remotely for the week, using vacation days he had accumulated and never taken. He asked Victor Klein to make 2 calls on his behalf. Then he drove home, parked in the driveway, sat in the car for 4 minutes, and walked inside. Elena was in the kitchen on her laptop coordinating a client event for the following weekend. She looked up. He set his keys on the counter. "I need to tell you something," he said. She closed the laptop halfway. "What happened?" "I got called in today," he said. "They're doing a restructuring. My position was eliminated." He watched her face in the way a man watches a structure under load, looking for where the response traveled first and whether it went where it was supposed to go. She said, "Wait, what?" "Effective end of the month," he said. "I have severance. We're not in trouble, but I wanted to tell you as soon as I knew." Her face moved through 3 expressions in 4 seconds. The third one, the one that settled, was not the one he had hoped for. It was not fear for him, or warmth toward him, or the particular kind of quiet solidarity that 9 years of partnership were supposed to produce. It was something more private, something that looked, from where he was standing, like calculation. "Okay," she said. She said it the way you'd say it when someone tells you the weather. She opened her laptop back up. He went to the garage and stood among his tools for a while. His hands didn't shake. She did not ask him a single question for the next 2 hours. Not about the severance package, not about their mortgage, not about what he planned to do next. She moved through the house on her own track, a call with a florist that lasted 11 minutes, a text thread that made her smile into the screen with the phone angled away, a glass of wine at the kitchen island while she scrolled something he wasn't meant to see. He sat in the living room on the couch he had reupholstered 2 winters ago, a project Elena had told him was not worth the effort, and which had come out better than the original. And he watched the late afternoon light move across the floor he had refinished, and felt the peculiar stillness of a man who has run the numbers and is waiting for the result he already knows. At the 4-hour mark, he heard her in the bedroom. A particular kind of quiet that was not the quiet of rest, the quiet of organized motion, deliberate and unhurried. The quiet of a woman who knows where everything is because she has already thought about where it goes. He walked to the doorway. She had his rolling suitcase open on the bed. His dress shirts were folded beside it, and his toiletry bag was already packed. And she was moving through his side of the closet with the focused economy of a woman who had rehearsed this. He stood in the doorway and said nothing for a long time. She turned and saw him and did not startle. She said, "I was going to talk to you tonight." "About what?" he said. She said she thought it might be better if he stayed somewhere else while he figured things out. That it might be good for both of them to have some space. That she had been feeling uncertain about things for a while. That she loved him, but didn't know if they wanted the same future anymore. He noted that she had arrived at all of this in under 6 hours. He noted that none of it referenced him at all. Not what he was going through, not what they might do together. Not a single question about whether he was all right. He moved with the same deliberate calm that defined all his actions. "I see," he said. He walked back to the kitchen and picked up his phone. Victor Klein kept a small office in a building near Beale Street that he had occupied for 22 years, and which smelled permanently of coffee and old paper, and the kind of certainty that comes from having been correct about difficult things for a very long time. He was 64 years old, lean and slow-spoken and precise. And when Marcus called him at 7:30 that evening, Victor answered on the second ring and listened without interrupting. And then said, "Come in tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Bring everything." Marcus was there at 7:55. Victor had a yellow legal pad in front of him and a pen in his hand, and the same expression he always wore, which was the expression of a man who had already considered 4 outcomes before you finished the first sentence. He had handled Marcus's business affairs for 6 years. He had also 3 years prior drawn up a prenuptial agreement that Marcus had presented to Elena before their wedding, and which Elena had signed with a particular kind of reluctant grace. A grace that now read differently in retrospect. Victor reviewed the prenuptial agreement on the desk between them. He reviewed the consulting practice's structure and accounts. He reviewed the property deed, the mortgage, and the joint checking account, which held a balance Elena could access unilaterally. She doesn't know about the consulting revenue, Victor said. It was not a question. She knows it exists, Marcus said. She doesn't know what it earns. Victor wrote something on the legal pad. The prenup protects the practice entirely. The marital home is joint. The joint account is accessible to both parties without restriction. How much time do I have? To move your assets into protected instruments before a filing. A few days if you're efficient. Victor paused. You need to move tonight. That was when Marcus made the second call. To his cousin Tyrone, who worked in commercial banking in Nashville, and who had been telling Marcus for years to structure his consulting revenue better. And who, when Marcus explained the situation in 3 sentences, said, "All right, let me make 2 calls. Call me back in an hour." He called back in 50 minutes. The vehicle he described was a properly structured spousal exempt holding instrument that would take 2 business days to establish and would require Marcus's presence in Nashville the following morning. Marcus said he would be there. The joint account held $19,400. Marcus moved his direct deposits and rerouted all consulting revenue that same afternoon, following the instruments Victor had outlined, and Tyrone had now scaffolded correctly. He did not touch the joint account. He had no reason to. He left it exactly as it was. $19,400 visible, accessible, sitting there like a door left open. Because Victor had been very specific about why the door needed to remain open. She needs to believe she sees the whole picture. Victor had said, hands flat on the desk. The moment she doubts the picture, she changes her strategy. You want her strategy fixed. You want her moving on assumptions. That's when the record she's building works against her instead of you. He had said it the way Marcus's grandfather might have said something about a beam under pressure. Not with drama, but with the practical authority of a man who had watched structures fail and understood exactly which stone you did not pull. Marcus listened. He always listened to men who had been right about difficult things over a long period of time. Real power operated in quiet rooms, and it never tipped its hand before the paperwork was ready. He did not go back to the house that night. He stayed at his Aunt Gloria's 3 miles away, in the room that had always been kept for him. The room with a photo of his grandmother on the dresser, and the quilt she had made from his old school shirts. And the window that looked out over a pecan tree in the backyard that his great-uncle had planted in 1971. He sat on the edge of that bed and looked at the photograph and felt the particular silence of someone who has confirmed something they had hoped was wrong. Gloria brought him tea without being asked and sat in the chair across from him and did not speak for a while. And then she said, "She moved fast." 6 hours, he said. Gloria looked at the photograph. "Baby, fast doesn't mean new. Fast means it was already built. She just needed the signal." She left him with that, and he sat with it for a long time, in the way you sit with something true that you were not ready to receive until you were sitting in exactly that chair, in exactly that quiet. He thought about Brandon refilling the glass, about the cologne, about the 3 expressions in 4 seconds, about the suitcase already open before she'd said a word, about the way she had not asked not one question, not about the severance or the mortgage or his plan, or whether he was frightened, because a woman building an exit does not ask questions that complicate the exit. She gathers what she has already decided to take, and she moves. He was a logistics man. He understood the difference between a route that was failing and one that had already failed. The only question was what you did with the cargo that remained. He opened his phone and looked at his consulting firm's account summary. The numbers were orderly. The numbers had always been orderly. He had built that practice before he built anything else in that marriage, before the house, before the joint account, before the years that had seemed like something and turned out to be a structure resting on a foundation only one of them had read. By Friday morning, Victor had filed for divorce on his behalf. By Friday afternoon, a process server had visited the house. The hearing was held in a family courtroom in Shelby County on a Thursday morning in March, 51 days after Marcus had stood in that kitchen doorway and told a lie that turned out to be the truest thing he had ever said in that house. Elena arrived with her attorney, a woman named Langley, who carried herself with the particular confidence of someone accustomed to large settlements. She had reviewed the joint assets, the marital property, and the consulting practice, or what she believed she knew of the consulting practice, and had built her position around the argument that Marcus's income from that practice had functionally supported the household and therefore constituted marital income subject to equitable division. Victor set 3 documents on the plaintiff's table. The first was the prenuptial agreement, signed and notarized, which exempted any business entity incorporated prior to the marriage. The consulting practice had been incorporated 11 months before their wedding. The second was a 5-year revenue summary of the practice, the existence and scale of which Elena's attorney had not obtained, had not subpoenaed, and had not been aware of until this moment. The third was a letter from Marcus's employer, his actual employer, confirming that he remained fully employed, that no restructuring had occurred, and that his position was secure. Langley read the third document and looked at the second, and then looked at Elena with the expression of an attorney who had just recalculated her afternoon. Elena looked at Marcus across the room for the first time since the process server had knocked. He looked back at her with the same quiet attention he had given her the day they met, and the day they married, and the evening he stood in the kitchen and told her something that was not true, and watched exactly who she was emerge in the space the lie created. He had not staged the test to be cruel. He wanted to be clear about that in the way a man is clear about things he has examined from every angle at 3 o'clock in the morning, and arrived at the same conclusion each time. He had staged it because he needed to know, not to punish her, not to build a case. Those things came later as a consequence of what the test revealed. He had needed to know because 9 years was a long time to invest in a structure, and he was the kind of man who verified load-bearing walls before he committed to the next floor. She had answered his question in 6 hours. The record answered everything else. She thought the job was all there was, Victor said quietly from beside him. Not for the room, just for Marcus. She never asked, Marcus said. Her attorney leaned toward her and spoke in a low voice. Elena shook her head once, then twice. A negotiation was beginning on her side of the room. Marcus watched it the way he watched freight systems, noting where the pressure was, where the delay was forming, where the route had already failed. The prenuptial agreement held. The consulting practice remained fully his. The marital home was appraised and split per the agreement's terms. The joint account, which Elena had withdrawn $14,000 from in the 9 days between his filing and the court's temporary financial restraining order, was addressed in the final settlement with a repayment obligation attached to her share of the property proceeds. She did not speak to him when it was over. He had not expected her to. He gathered his folder and shook Victor's hand and walked out of that building into a March morning that was cold and bright and entirely his. He was done. 10 months had passed like freight through a clear route without incident, without delay, exactly as planned. Marcus was in the kitchen of a house in East Nashville, a smaller house than the one he had left, but one he had chosen with deliberate attention to what he actually needed rather than what had been accumulated out of habit. He had installed the shelving in the pantry himself, and the light fixture above the sink and the porch boards that creaked in a place he had identified and corrected on a Saturday morning, while his neighbor's dog watched from the fence. A woman named Sophia sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a document spread in front of her. She was a contracts attorney, and she brought work home the way people who love their work do, not out of duty, but out of genuine interest. She had asked him the second time they went to dinner what he actually did for a living. Not the title, the work. What it required of him. He had told her, and she had listened to the whole of it, and asked a follow-up question that told him she had understood the first part. He had noticed that. He had noticed it the way he noticed everything that mattered, quietly without announcing it, filing it where it would not be lost. The consulting practice had added a fourth client, a distribution firm out of Birmingham, and the revenue from the first quarter had required a conversation with his accountant about restructuring the entity again in a direction Tyrone had recommended and Victor had approved. The numbers were healthy. The numbers had always been healthy. He had just not always shared them with the right people. Brandon had moved into the house within 3 months of Elena's departure from it. Marcus knew this through Gloria, who knew it through a neighbor, and who had reported it with the measured neutrality of a woman who had long since made her own assessment. Brandon's construction company, Marcus understood through a business acquaintance, had lost a significant municipal contract the prior fall, a contract that had been its primary revenue source. The loss had required Brandon to reduce staff and renegotiate with 2 of his primary subcontractors. The house Elena had expected to move into freely was now carrying more debt than she had known to anticipate. Marcus registered this information without comment and moved on, the way he moved past anything he had already assessed and set down. Elena was managing a smaller event portfolio now, one that did not include the corporate clients her former reputation had drawn. Some doors in that industry had the habit of swinging on reputation, and reputation was a structure that required maintenance. She had been managing too many things at once to maintain it properly. Her former business partner had moved on to a separate venture in the spring. Marcus had heard this from no one in particular, only absorbed it the way you absorb background information about a place you no longer live, without investment, without satisfaction, simply as data that confirmed what the structure had always been. Marcus poured a second cup of coffee and set it near Sophia's elbow without interrupting her, and she reached for it without looking up. And the ease of that exchange, the ordinary unperformed ease of it, was something he registered and did not take for granted. He looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, at the raised garden bed he had built in October and planted in November, which was already showing the early green of the season's first growth. He thought of his grandmother's voice from a room 3 decades behind him, steady and unhurried. The way someone acts when the money stops is the only true thing you will ever learn about them. He had learned it. He had also learned that the money had never stopped. The money had simply moved to where it was always going to be safe. In the hands of the man who had built it before anyone else arrived to benefit from it, he was free, he was whole, he was building again. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.